The gates of Varengard burst open with a sound like thunder cracking the sky in half, and Alira did not scream, though every part of her wanted to. She stood in the back of a wooden cart, wrists bound with rough rope, watching the towers of the enemy kingdom rise higher and higher above her as the horses pulled her closer to the place that had taken everything from her. 3 days had passed since her home had fallen. 3 days since she had watched the fields of her family's land turn orange with fire, since she had heard her brother's voice call her name one last time before the soldiers dragged her away. She had not cried since then. She refused to give the men who held her that satisfaction. Instead, she held her spine straight and her chin high, even as the cart rattled over broken stones and her stomach twisted with hunger and fear. The soldiers around her wore the black and silver colors of King Alaric, ruler of Varengard, the man whose name had been spoken like a curse in her household for as long as she could remember. She had grown up hearing stories about him, about his cold eyes and colder heart, about how he took what he wanted and left ruin behind him. Now she was living inside one of those stories, and there was no way to wake up from it. The cart stopped in a wide stone courtyard, filled with more soldiers than Alira had ever seen in one place. She was pulled down roughly, her knees nearly buckling beneath her after days of little food and less rest. A woman in gray robes stepped forward, her face unreadable, and took Alira's arm without gentleness. "Move," the woman said. "The king wishes to see the prisoners before nightfall." Prisoners. The word landed heavy in Alira's chest. She was not a guest. She was not even a hostage in the way stories described hostages, treated with careful respect, because they might one day be useful. She was simply a prisoner, a piece taken from a broken board, waiting to be discarded or used. They walked her through corridors lined with tall windows, sunlight falling in long gold strips across the floor. Despite herself, Alira noticed the beauty of the place. The stone walls were carved with patterns of vines and stars, and tapestries hung between them showing scenes of old battles and older peace treaties. It was strange to see such beauty in a place built by a man capable of so much destruction. She was brought at last to a great hall with a high ceiling and a throne carved from pale stone at its far end. And there, for the first time, Alira saw King Alaric. He was younger than she expected. The stories had painted him as an ancient, monstrous figure, but the man seated on the throne looked to be no older than 30 years, with dark hair pushed back from a face that might have been handsome if it were not so tired. His eyes, when they found her across the hall, were not cold at all. They were sharp, yes, and guarded, but there was something else in them too, something that looked almost like pain. Alira lifted her chin and stared back at him without fear, though her heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. "This is the girl from the border house?" Alaric asked, his voice low and even. "Yes, Your Majesty," the gray-robed woman answered. "The last surviving member of that line, as far as our scouts could confirm." Something flickered across the king's face at those words. Alira could not name it, but it looked almost like guilt, quickly hidden away again behind a mask of calm authority. "She will be kept in the East Wing," Alaric said. "Comfortable rooms. She is not to be harmed." A murmur passed through the hall, soldiers and advisors exchanging glances that Alira could not decipher. She herself felt a spark of anger rise in her chest at his words. Comfortable rooms. As if comfort could undo the fire that had eaten her home, the silence where her brother's voice used to be. "I do not want your comfort," Alira said, her voice cutting sharply through the hall before she could stop herself. "I want my home back. I want my brother back. You cannot give me either of those things, so do not pretend that a soft bed will make this bearable." The hall fell utterly silent. No one, it seemed, spoke to the king of Varengard that way. Alira braced herself for punishment, for anger, for the cruelty the stories had promised her. Instead, Alaric simply looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression cracked, just slightly, like the first thin line in a sheet of ice. "Take her to her rooms," he said quietly, and turned away before she could see anything more in his face. The East Wing was, as promised, far from a dungeon. Illyra was given a chamber with a wide window overlooking a garden, a soft bed, warm water to wash with, and clean clothes to wear. She hated every bit of it. She would have rather been thrown into a cold cell, because at least then her anger would have had somewhere honest to live. Instead, she was surrounded by comfort built on the ashes of her family, and it made her feel sick. That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the window and watched the moon rise over the garden, thinking of her brother's laugh, of her mother's hands braiding her hair, of the home that no longer existed except in her memory. She promised herself, in the silence of that unfamiliar room, that she would never forgive the man who had done this. She would never let herself soften toward him, no matter what kindness he showed her. Kindness from a man like that was nothing but another kind of cage. Days passed, and Illyra learned the shape of her new life. She was not permitted to leave the East Wing without an escort, but within its walls she had more freedom than she expected. She was given books to read, though she often threw them across the room in frustration. She was given fine meals, though she sometimes refused to eat out of stubborn anger. She was watched, always, by quiet guards who never met her eyes, and by the gray-robed woman, whose name she learned was Old Wenna, keeper of the East Wing and, Illyra suspected, someone with far more knowledge of the kingdom's secrets than she let on. It was Wenna who first mentioned the king's strange behavior. "He asks about you," Wenna said one afternoon, setting down a tray of tea Illyra had not requested. "Every day, how you are eating, whether you are sleeping, whether the guards have been respectful." "Why would he care?" Illyra asked, not bothering to hide her bitterness. "I am nothing to him, a prisoner, a piece of a war he started." Wenna's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You would be surprised, child, how little kings choose their own wars." Before Illyra could ask what she meant, the old woman had already turned and left the room, leaving the question hanging unanswered in the quiet air. It was 3 days later that Illyra saw the king again, this time not in the great hall but in the garden beneath her window. She had slipped out with permission to walk among the flowers, one of the few freedoms she allowed herself to enjoy, when she found him standing alone beside a fountain, his back to her, his shoulders tense in a way that suggested he did not know she was there. She should have turned back. Every instinct told her to avoid him, to protect the careful wall of anger she had built around her heart. But something about the stillness of his posture, the way his hand gripped the edge of the fountain as though he needed it to remain standing, made her pause. He turned before she could retreat, and their eyes met across the garden. "I did not mean to disturb you," Illyra said stiffly, already stepping back toward the path. "You are not disturbing me," Illyric said. His voice sounded rougher than it had in the hall, less like a king and more like a man carrying something heavy. "Please, stay, if you wish. The garden is yours to walk as much as it is mine." "Nothing here is mine," Illyra said before she could stop herself. "You made sure of that." She expected anger. She expected him to remind her of her place, to have her escorted back to her rooms in silence. Instead, he simply looked at her, and there was so much sorrow in his expression that for a moment she forgot to hate him. "You are right to be angry with me," he said quietly. "I will not ask you to forgive what happened to your home. I do not forgive myself for it either." The words struck her like a blow, though she could not have said why. She had expected excuses, denials, the cold justifications of a conqueror. She had not expected this. "Then why?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "Why did you let it happen?" Alaric's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, staring past her toward the darkening sky as though searching for an answer he did not have. "There are things happening in this kingdom," he said finally. "Things I do not yet understand myself. Choices that were made in my name that I did not make. I know that does not undo what you lost. Nothing can undo that. But I promise you, Illyra, I am trying to find the truth of what happened to your family." It was the first time he had spoken her name, and hearing it in his voice sent an unwelcome shiver through her chest. She hated how it made her feel less like a prisoner and more like a person again, seen rather than simply held. "I do not want your promises," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fire. "I want the truth. All of it. Now." "I do not have all of it yet," Alaric admitted. "But when I do, you will hear it before anyone else in this kingdom." She did not know what to say to that. She turned instead and walked back toward the east wing, her heart pounding with a confusion she refused to examine too closely. She told herself it was only anger that made her chest feel so tight. Only anger that made her steps quicken. Only anger that made her glance back once, just once, to see him still standing by the fountain, watching her go with an expression she could not name and did not want to understand. That night, sleep finally came to her, though it was restless and filled with strange dreams she could not remember by morning. She woke with the sense that something in her had shifted, some small crack forming in the wall she had built, and the realization frightened her more than anything the king himself had said or done. Over the following days, small kindnesses began to appear in her life, quiet and unclaimed. A book she had once mentioned wanting appeared on her table. The guards who escorted her grew gentler in their manner. The meals brought to her began to include the foods of her homeland, simple dishes she had not tasted since the fire took everything. She never saw the king give these orders, but she knew, somehow, that they came from him. She told herself it changed nothing. He had still destroyed her home. He had still taken her brother's future from him, whether by his own hand or by the hands of those who acted in his name. No small kindness could erase that. And yet, despite her fierce determination to hate him without exception, she found herself thinking of him more often than she wished to admit, remembering the sorrow in his eyes by the fountain, wondering what secrets he carried that he had not yet shared. One evening, Wenna came to her with unusual urgency in her steps. "The king wishes to speak with you," she said. "Tonight. Alone." Elira's stomach turned with a mixture of dread and something else she refused to name. "Why?" "I do not know the full reason," Wenna said, though something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. "But I believe, child, that whatever he tells you tonight will change everything you think you understand about why you are here." Elira followed the old woman through the quiet corridors of the castle, her heart hammering with every step, unaware that the truth waiting for her in the king's private chamber would not only reshape her understanding of the war that destroyed her family, but would bind her future to the very man she had sworn never to forgive. Elira stood outside the tall wooden door of the king's private chamber, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to steady her breathing before Wenna knocked. The corridor was quiet at this hour, lit only by a few flickering torches, and the silence pressed against her like a weight. "Whatever he tells you," Wenna murmured before knocking. "Listen with your whole mind before you let your anger answer for you." The door opened before Elira could ask what that meant. Alaric stood on the other side, dressed simply now, without the heavy ceremonial robes he wore in the great hall. He looked younger this way, and more tired, dark shadows resting beneath his eyes, as though sleep had abandoned him for many nights. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. The chamber was smaller than she expected for a king, warm with candlelight and lined with shelves of old books and scrolls. A fire burned low in the hearth. It felt less like the room of a ruler and more like the private study of a scholar, and despite herself, Elira found her curiosity stirring, even through her wariness. "You said you wanted to speak with me," she said, standing near the door, unwilling to move further into the room until she understood why she had been summoned. "So speak." Alaric gestured to a chair near the fire, but when she did not move, he did not press her. Instead, he remained standing as well, his hands clasped behind his back, as though bracing himself for what he had to say. "There is a truth about my family," he began slowly, "about the bloodline of Verengard's kings, that very few outside this castle know. It is old magic, tied to the land itself, passed down through generations. Every king of my line has carried it, and every king has needed something to keep it steady." Illyra frowned, unsure where this was leading. "What does this have to do with me?" "The magic requires a bond," Alaric continued, his voice carefully controlled, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. "A connection between the king and one other person, formed not by choice, but by the nature of the bloodline itself. Without that bond, the magic grows unstable. It affects the king's mind, his temper, his judgment. It has, in the past, driven kings to madness." A cold feeling began to spread through Illyra's chest, though she could not yet understand why his words frightened her so deeply. "For years I refused to seek that bond," Alaric said. "I told myself I could rule without it, that I could control the magic through will alone. I was wrong. In recent months it has grown worse. My advisors grew concerned, and when they searched for the person whose blood might answer mine, whose presence might calm what is breaking inside me, they found." He stopped. Illyra felt her heart drop even before he finished the sentence, some instinct within her already understanding what he could not yet say aloud. "They found me," she whispered. Alaric's silence was answer enough. "You knew this," Illyra said, her voice rising with disbelief and fury as pieces began to fall into place. "This is why I am here, not simply because I am a prisoner of war. You brought me here because your council decided I was useful to you, the way a tool is useful, the way a key is useful for a lock." "I did not know until after you had already arrived," Alaric said quickly, stepping toward her. "I swear to you, Illyra, I did not order the attack on your home for this reason. I did not even know your name until my council brought your case before me days after the fighting had ended." "That does not make it better," Illyra snapped, backing away from him. "It means the men who serve you burned my home and took my family from me before you even knew who I was, and now that you know, you intend to use me anyway. Is that not so? Is that not the truth you brought me here to tell?" Alaric's face was pale in the candlelight, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like shame. "I have not asked anything of you," he said quietly. "I have not asked for the bond. My council urges me to, every day, more forcefully as the magic grows harder to control. But I have refused to force this upon you. I wanted you to know the truth before any decision was made, because you deserve to understand exactly why you are here and exactly what is being asked of the both of us." Illyra's hands were trembling, though whether from anger or fear she could not tell. "And if you do not accept this bond, what then?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Then the magic will continue to grow unstable within me. I do not know what that means for my mind, or for this kingdom, in the long run. Kings before me who refused the bond did not end their rule peacefully." The weight of his words settled over the room like smoke. Illyra thought of the fire that had taken her home, of her brother's voice silenced forever, and now she was being told that the very man responsible, whether by his hand or by hands acting falsely in his name, needed her to save himself from the darkness growing inside him. "You expect me to help you," she said slowly, disbelief coloring every word. "After everything your kingdom has taken from me, you expect me to give you the one thing that might save your throne." "I expect nothing," Alaric said firmly. "I told you this because you deserve honesty, not because I intend to force your hand. Whatever you decide, whatever you choose to do with this knowledge, I will not command you into a bond you do not wish to accept. I have seen enough of what forced power does to people. I will not become another cause of your suffering." Illyra studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie she was certain must be hidden somewhere in his expression. But she found none, only exhaustion, and a strange, quiet desperation that unsettled her far more than outright cruelty would have. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quieter now, though no less firm. "I need time to think about what you have told me." "Take whatever time you need," Alaric said. "I will not press you for an answer. I only ask that you do not let my counsel pressure you either. This decision, whatever it becomes, Must be yours, and yours alone. Alira left his chamber that night with more questions than she had entered with, her mind spinning with the impossible weight of what she had learned. She returned to her own rooms and sat by the window long after Wenna had gone, staring out at the moonlit garden without truly seeing it. Word of her private meeting with the king spread quickly through the castle, though the details remained closely guarded. Over the following days, Alira noticed changes in how the court regarded her. Advisors who had once looked past her now watched her with calculating interest. Servants whispered when they thought she could not hear. And one man in particular, a tall figure with sharp gray eyes named Lord Corwin, began to seek her out with unsettling regularity. "You understand the importance of what has been asked of you," Corwin said one afternoon, finding her alone in the garden. "The kingdom's stability depends upon the bond being formed. Every day it is delayed is a day closer to disaster." "The king told me the choice is mine," Alira said coolly, refusing to be moved by his urgency. "The king is a compassionate man," Corwin said, his tone carrying an edge she did not trust. "But compassion does not always serve a kingdom well. If he will not press you, others of us understand the greater need." "Is that a threat, my lord?" Corwin's smile did not reach his eyes. "It is a reminder, my lady, that kingdoms do not wait patiently for personal feelings to resolve themselves. I would advise you to consider your decision carefully and swiftly." He left her standing alone among the flowers, her heart pounding with a fresh wave of unease. She began to understand, in that moment, that the danger surrounding her was not only the grief of her past or the strange pull she felt toward a king she was supposed to hate. There were other forces within these walls, forces with their own reasons for wanting the bond formed, reasons that had nothing to do with her well-being or even the king's. That night, she sought out Wenna, finding the old woman in a small chamber near the kitchens, sorting dried herbs by candlelight. "Tell me about Lord Corwin," Alira said without preamble. Wenna's hands stilled over the herbs. "Why do you ask?" "He approached me today. He spoke of the bond as though it were already decided, as though my choice mattered little beside the kingdom's need." The old woman's expression grew troubled. "Corwin has long desired greater influence over the throne. He was among those who pushed hardest for the campaign against the border houses, though he claimed it was necessity, not ambition, that drove him." Alira felt a chill settle over her. "Are you saying he had a hand in what happened to my home?" "I am saying," Wenna said carefully, "that not everything done in the king's name was done by the king's true will. There are many who serve their own purposes beneath the banner of loyalty. You would do well to trust your own judgment above the voices that surround you, whoever they may be." Alira left that conversation with more unanswered questions than before, and a growing certainty that the truth of her family's destruction was far more tangled than she had first believed. She thought of Alaric's sorrow by the fountain, of his careful honesty in his private chamber, and she wondered, for the first time, whether the enemy she had been taught to hate was truly the man on the throne, or someone else entirely, hiding in the shadows behind him. As the days passed, the bond between her and the king remained undecided, a question hanging heavy over the castle like an approaching storm. And though Alira told herself again and again that she owed Alaric nothing, that her heart must remain guarded against him no matter what she learned, she found it growing harder each day to remember exactly why. The days that followed were heavy with a tension Alira could not shake. Every corner of the castle seemed to whisper about the bond, about the fate of the kingdom, about the strange prisoner who held such power over the king without lifting a single finger. She began to feel like a piece on a game board, moved by forces far larger than herself, and the feeling made her chest tighten with something close to panic. She spent her mornings walking the garden alone, using the quiet hours before the court woke to think clearly, away from Corwin's calculating gaze and Wenna's careful watchfulness. It was during one of these walks that she first noticed the change in Alaric. She saw him from a distance, standing near the training yard, watching his soldiers with an expression that seemed distant, almost unfocused. As she drew closer, she noticed his hand trembling slightly at his side, a small thing that he quickly hid when he realized she was near. "Are you well?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. She had not intended to speak to him at all. Alaric turned to her, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes that did not look entirely like himself, a shadow of something darker passing swiftly across his expression before he composed himself again. "I am well enough," he said, though his voice carried a strain she had not heard before. "Forgive me. I did not sleep well." Illyra studied him carefully, remembering his words about the magic growing unstable, about the danger of what might happen if the bond remained unformed. She had told herself she needed time before deciding anything, but watching him now, seeing the toll his condition was already taking, she felt her resolve waver in ways she did not want to examine too closely. "Is it getting worse?" she asked quietly. "The magic within you?" Alaric's jaw tightened. "It comes and goes. Some days are easier than others. I do not wish to burden you with it further than I already have." "You already told me my choice affects your fate," Illyra said, a note of frustration entering her voice. "How can I not be burdened by that, whether you speak of it further or not?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. "I never wanted you to feel burdened, Illyra. I wanted you to have the truth, and the freedom to choose without pressure. If watching me struggle changes your feelings on the matter, then I have already failed at what I set out to do." Before she could answer, a commotion near the castle gates drew both their attention. A rider had arrived, dust-covered and breathless, calling for an audience with the king. Alaric's expression shifted instantly into something more guarded, the king reasserting himself over the tired man she had glimpsed only moments before. "Forgive me," he said. "Duty calls." He left her standing alone in the garden, her mind spinning with confusion she did not know how to untangle. She told herself, once again, that her sympathy for him changed nothing about what his kingdom had done to her family, and yet the lie felt thinner each time she repeated it to herself. That evening, news spread through the castle of what the rider had brought. A neighboring territory, sensing weakness in Varengard's leadership, had begun making aggressive moves along the border, testing the kingdom's defenses. The court was thrown into a flurry of preparation, and Illyra found herself, for the first time since her arrival, almost forgotten amid the larger concerns pressing upon the castle. She used the distraction to seek out information on her own, slipping quietly through corridors she had not yet explored, listening carefully to the conversations of servants and soldiers, who no longer paid her much attention. It was during one of these quiet explorations that she overheard a conversation that changed the course of her understanding entirely. Two soldiers stood near a supply room, their voices low but not quiet enough to escape her notice as she paused behind a nearby pillar. "Lord Corwin grows impatient," one soldier murmured. "He says if the king will not force the girl's hand soon, other measures may be needed." "Other measures?" the second soldier repeated uneasily. "You mean like what was done to her family's house?" The first soldier's voice dropped even lower. "I mean nothing. Forget I spoke." Illyra's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the soldiers would hear it even from behind the pillar. She waited until they had moved away before she allowed herself to breathe again, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. Corwin, it seemed, had far more influence over the destruction of her home than she had previously suspected, and his patience for the bond to be formed naturally appeared to be running out. She returned to her rooms that night unable to sleep, turning the pieces of information over and over in her mind. If Corwin had orchestrated the attack on her family's estate to force the very crisis now threatening the kingdom, then Alaric's guilt, while perhaps deserved for the actions of those under his rule, was not the full truth of what had happened to her. There was a deeper conspiracy at work, one that used both her and the king as pieces in a much larger and more dangerous game. The next morning, she sought out Wenna with new urgency, recounting what she had overheard the night before. The old woman's face grew grave as she listened, her hands stilling over the tea she had been preparing. "This is more dangerous than I feared," Wenna said quietly. "If Corwin believes he can force the bond through fear or manipulation, he will not hesitate to act. You must be careful, child. Trust no one within these walls who seeks to hurry your decision, no matter how urgent they claim the need to be." "Should I tell the king what I heard?" Illyra asked. Wenna hesitated before answering. "The king trusts Corwin as an advisor of long standing. Without proof beyond a servant's whispered words, an accusation could do more harm than good, turning the court against you rather than against the true danger. Gather what evidence you can, quietly, before you bring this to him." Illyra spent the following days moving carefully through the castle, watching Corwin with new suspicion, noting his movements, his conversations, the way he seemed always to be present wherever decisions about the kingdom's stability were being made. She found herself growing more skilled at this quiet observation than she ever expected, driven by a determination to uncover the truth not only for her own sake, but, she realized with some surprise, for Alaric's as well. It was during one of these careful observations that she noticed Corwin meeting privately with a hooded figure near the castle's outer wall, far from the usual paths of servants and soldiers. She watched from a distance, unable to hear their words but noting the exchange of a small sealed letter between them before the hooded figure disappeared into the evening shadows. Her heart raced as she considered what she had witnessed. It was not proof of anything definitive, but it confirmed her growing suspicion that Corwin's ambitions extended far beyond simple political maneuvering within the castle walls. That night, unable to keep the information to herself any longer, she made her way to Alaric's private chamber, driven by an urgency she could no longer ignore. When he opened the door and saw the expression on her face, his own concern immediately sharpened. "What has happened?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in. Illyra recounted everything she had heard and seen over the past days, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something colder and more dangerous, as the pieces began to align in his mind as well. "Corwin has served my family for many years," Alaric said slowly, though the certainty in his voice had begun to waver. "I find it difficult to believe he would act against the kingdom's interests so directly." "Perhaps he believes he is acting in the kingdom's interests," Illyra said. "Perhaps he believes that forcing the bond, by whatever means necessary, is worth the cost, even if that cost includes manipulating the very crisis he claims to be solving." Alaric was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he paced the length of the chamber. "If what you suspect is true, then he orchestrated the attack on your home not out of loyalty to the crown, but to create the very circumstance that would force your presence here. And force your hand toward the bond," Illyra finished quietly, "regardless of whether either of us wished for it." The weight of the realization settled heavily between them. For the first time since her arrival, Illyra saw something other than sorrow or guilt in Alaric's eyes. She saw anger, sharp and cold, directed not at her, but at the betrayal within his own court. "I will not confront him without proof," Alaric said finally, his voice controlled despite the fury simmering beneath it. "If he suspects we know, he may act more recklessly, and I fear what that recklessness could mean, not only for the stability of this kingdom, but for your safety as well." "Then what do we do?" Illyra asked. Alaric looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that passed between them, unspoken but understood. They were no longer simply captor and captive, king and prisoner. They had become, in this moment, allies against a danger neither of them had fully understood until now. "We find the proof," he said quietly, "together." The decision to work together against Corwin changed something quiet but significant between Illyra and Alaric. Where once their conversations had been guarded, filled with the weight of grief and suspicion, they now found themselves speaking with a strange new honesty, bound by a shared purpose that neither of them had expected to find. They began meeting in secret, late in the evenings when the castle had grown quiet, poring over old records and letters in Alaric's private study, searching for any connection between Corwin and the attack on Illyra's home. It was slow, careful work, and more than once, Illyra found herself watching Alaric across the candlelit table rather than the documents before her, studying the furrow of concentration on his brow, the quiet determination in his eyes. She told herself these moments meant nothing. She told herself she was simply grateful for his help in uncovering the truth, nothing more. But the lie grew harder to believe with each passing night. "Here," Alaric said one evening, sliding a worn ledger across the table toward her. "Records of supply requisitions from the months before the attack on your family's estate. Look at the signatures authorizing troop movement toward the border." Illyra leaned forward, scanning the careful script. Her breath caught as she recognized Corwin's seal beside an order that predated the official declaration of conflict by several weeks. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew the attack was coming before it was ever announced to your council. Or he arranged for it to happen," Alaric said grimly, "using forged authority in my name, knowing that once the deed was done, none would question orders already carried out." The confirmation, though not yet complete proof, sent a wave of cold anger through Illyra's chest. She had spent weeks believing, at least in part, that the kingdom's aggression toward her home had come from Alaric's own command, however reluctant. Discovering that a man serving beneath him had orchestrated such destruction for his own ambitions did not erase her grief, but it reshaped the shape of her anger, redirecting it toward a target that felt, for the first time, entirely justified. "We need more than this," Alaric said, closing the ledger carefully. "Enough to bring before the full council. Enough that Corwin cannot simply claim forgery or misunderstanding." "Then we continue searching," Illyra said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own resolve. Over the following days, their search deepened, and so too did the quiet bond growing between them, unacknowledged but undeniable. Illyra found herself looking forward to their evening meetings, with an eagerness she tried and failed to suppress. She told herself it was simply the shared purpose that drew her, the alliance against a common enemy. But when Alaric smiled at her across the table, however briefly, however tired, she felt something warm bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with justice or revenge. Corwin, however, was not idle during this time. Illyra began to notice him watching her more closely during the daylight hours, his sharp eyes following her movements through the castle with an intensity that unsettled her. She grew careful in her steps, aware that if he suspected what she and Alaric had discovered, he might act to protect himself before they could gather enough proof to expose him. Her fears proved justified one evening when she returned to her chamber to find it disturbed. Her belongings shifted slightly from where she had left them, as though someone had searched through her things while she was away. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the violation of her privacy left her shaken, her hands trembling as she surveyed the room. She reported the incident to Wenna immediately, who grew pale at the news. "Corwin suspects something," the old woman said. "You must be more careful than ever, child. If he believes you and the king are working against him, he will not hesitate to act more directly." "What can he do?" Illyra asked. "He cannot move against the king openly without proof of his own crimes coming to light." "He does not need to move against the king directly," Wenna said grimly. "He need only remove the piece that threatens him most. And that piece, I fear, is you." The warning settled over Illyra like a shadow, and though she tried to dismiss the fear as excessive caution, she found herself sleeping poorly in the nights that followed, startling at every sound in the corridor outside her chamber. Alaric, when she told him of the search of her rooms, grew visibly alarmed, his careful composure slipping to reveal the depth of his concern. "I should have assigned additional guards to your chamber from the beginning," he said, pacing the length of his study with barely contained frustration. "I was foolish to believe discretion alone would be enough to protect you." "I do not want to hide behind guards," Illyra said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the fear beneath her defiance. "I want the truth exposed, so that Corwin no longer has the power to threaten either of us." "And I want you safe," Alaric said, his voice suddenly rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. "Elira, whatever else is true between us, whatever grief and anger still stands unresolved from what happened to your family, I cannot bear the thought of losing you to this man's ambition." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for. Elira felt her heart pound painfully in her chest, torn between the instinct to retreat behind her old anger and the undeniable warmth that had begun to grow in its place. "I am not yours to lose," she said quietly, though the words lacked their usual sharpness. "I do not belong to you, Alaric. I never will, no matter what magic runs through your blood or what bond your council demands." "I know that," Alaric said, stepping closer despite the caution that had governed their interactions until now. "I have never wanted you to belong to me as a possession, Elira. I only wish, if the bond is ever formed between us, that it comes not from fear or desperation, but from something you choose freely, for yourself." The vulnerability in his voice, the honesty in his eyes, undid something in Elira that she had fought hard to protect. She did not step away from him as he drew closer, and when his hand rose gently to brush a strand of hair from her face, she did not pull back from his touch. "I do not know what I feel toward you," she admitted softly, the words costing her more than she expected. "I hate what your kingdom has done. I hate that I am here because of violence I did not choose, but I do not hate you, not anymore, not as simply as I once believed I could." Alaric's expression softened with something close to relief, though the weight of unresolved danger still lingered heavily around them both. "That is more honesty than I dared hope for," he said quietly. Their moment together was interrupted by an urgent knock at the study door. Alaric stepped back, composing himself quickly before opening it to find one of his most trusted guards, breathless and grim-faced. "Your Majesty," the guard said, "Lord Corwin has left the castle grounds under cover of darkness, accompanied by several armed men. His destination is unknown, but the stablemaster reports he rode toward the northern border." Alaric's expression hardened instantly into the focused authority of a king facing crisis. "Gather my personal guard. We ride within the hour." "I am coming with you," Elira said immediately, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Elira, it is not safe. None of this has been safe since the moment I arrived here," she interrupted firmly. "I will not sit idle in my chamber while the man responsible for my family's destruction escapes into the night. I am coming with you, Alaric, whether you permit it or not." Alaric studied her for a long moment, and though concern remained etched deeply into his features, he did not argue further. "Then stay close to me," he said. "Whatever happens tonight, I will not let harm come to you if it is within my power to prevent it." As the castle stirred to life around them, preparing for a hurried pursuit into the northern darkness, Elira felt a strange calm settle over her, despite the danger ahead. For the first time since the fire had taken her home, she felt as though she was moving towards something rather than simply surviving what had been done to her. Whatever awaited them at the border, whatever confrontation lay ahead with the man who had orchestrated so much suffering, she intended to face it not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone finally reclaiming control over her own fate. The ride north was fast and hard, the horses' hooves pounding against the frozen ground beneath a sky heavy with clouds that hid the moon. Elira rode close beside Alaric, her cloak wrapped tightly against the biting wind, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Around them, a dozen of the king's most trusted guards rode in tight formation, their faces set with the same tense focus that gripped their leader. "How far to the border?" Elira called over the wind. 2 hours at this pace," Alaric answered, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "If Corwin intends to cross into neighboring territory, he will need to pass through the old forest road. It is the only route swift enough for a man in a hurry to escape notice." "And if he is not simply escaping?" Elira asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest since they departed the castle. "What if he intends something worse than flight?" Alaric's jaw tightened, but he did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the pounding of hooves and the whistle of wind through bare branches, until finally he spoke. Corwin has spent years cultivating relationships with the very territories now testing our borders, he said grimly. If he believes his schemes are close to discovery, he may seek to align himself with our enemies, rather than face judgment within these walls. The thought sent a fresh wave of urgency through Alira's chest. If Corwin succeeded in fleeing to hostile territory, he would not only escape justice for what he had done to her family, but he might also provide crucial information to enemies already probing the kingdom's weakened defenses. The stakes of their pursuit had grown far larger than she had first understood. They reached the edge of the old forest as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the horizon, gray and cold. Alaric raised a hand, signaling the guards to slow their pace, his eyes scanning the tree line with practiced caution. "There," one of the guards called quietly, pointing toward a faint trail of disturbed earth leading into the trees. "Recent tracks, Your Majesty. Several horses, moving quickly." Alaric nodded grimly. "We follow on foot from here. The trees are too dense for horses to move quietly, and I do not wish to announce our approach." They dismounted, leaving the horses in the care of 2 guards while the rest moved carefully into the shadowed forest. Alira stayed close to Alaric's side, her senses sharpened by fear and adrenaline, every rustle of leaves and snap of twig sending her heart leaping into her throat. They had not gone far when the sound of voices reached them, low and urgent, carried faintly on the cold morning air. Alaric raised a hand, halting the group, and gestured for silence as he crept forward to peer through a gap in the trees. Alira moved beside him, careful to stay low, and felt her breath catch as she saw the scene ahead. Corwin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by several armed men, speaking urgently, with a figure dressed in the colors of a neighboring territory, colors Alira recognized from the stories of conflict along the border. "The girl is the key," Corwin was saying, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear. "If the king forms the bond with her, Varengard's stability will be secured for another generation. We cannot allow that to happen. Your forces must strike before the bond is completed, while the kingdom remains vulnerable." Alira felt cold fury rise within her at his words. Not only had Corwin orchestrated her family's destruction to force this crisis, he now intended to use the resulting instability to weaken the entire kingdom for the benefit of its enemies, betraying the very crown he had sworn to serve. Beside her, she felt Alaric's body go rigid with barely contained anger. His hand moved slowly to the hilt of his sword, and though he made no sound, she could feel the fury radiating from him like heat from a flame. "We have heard enough," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "It is time to end this." He rose from their hiding place, stepping into the clearing with the full authority of a king, his guards moving swiftly to flank the startled group before them. "Lord Corwin," Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing, cold and controlled despite the fury Alira knew burned beneath the surface. "I believe you have some explaining to do." Corwin's face paled for only a moment before hardening into something calculating and cold. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying false surprise, "I did not expect you to follow me so far from the castle. I was simply meeting with representatives from the northern territories to discuss matters of border security." "Do not insult me with lies," Alaric said sharply. "We heard your words, Corwin. We know what you have done, from the attack on Lady Alira's home to this treasonous meeting with our enemies." The clearing fell tense and silent, the armed men on both sides watching carefully, waiting for a signal that might spark violence. Alira's heart pounded painfully in her chest as she watched Corwin's expression shift from false innocence to cold calculation. "You do not understand what you have interrupted," Corwin said finally, his voice losing its pretense of loyalty. "The kingdom's stability has always mattered more to me than sentiment, Your Majesty. Your refusal to secure the bond threatened everything your family has built. I did what was necessary to force a resolution, nothing more." "You destroyed an innocent family," Alaric said, his voice trembling now with barely restrained rage. "You murdered Alira's brother and burned her home to the ground, all to manufacture a crisis for your own political ambitions. There is no justification for that, Corwin. None. Ambition," Corwin spat, "is what has held this kingdom together while you hesitated, burdened by needless guilt and sentiment unfit for a ruler. I have served Varengard's true interests, even when you were too weak to see them clearly yourself." The tension in the clearing snapped like a taut wire. Corwin's men moved first, drawing weapons in a desperate bid to protect their leader, and chaos erupted through the quiet forest clearing. Illyra found herself pulled quickly behind Alaric as his guards moved to meet the sudden threat, the clash of steel ringing sharply through the cold morning air. She watched, heart in her throat, as Alaric fought with a controlled fury she had not expected, his movements precise despite the danger surrounding him. She wanted desperately to help, to do something beyond simply standing frozen with fear, and when one of Corwin's men broke through the guard's formation, moving toward her with clear intent, instinct took over where training could not. She grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, swinging it with all the strength her fear provided, catching the attacking man across the arm just as he raised his weapon. It was enough to disrupt his aim, giving one of the king's guards the opening needed to subdue him fully. Across the clearing, Alaric had cornered Corwin himself, his sword raised, his expression a mixture of fury and something that looked almost like grief for the betrayal of a man he had once trusted. "It did not have to end this way," Alaric said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You could have brought your concerns to me honestly, Corwin. Instead, you chose destruction and treason." "You would not have listened," Corwin said bitterly, lowering his own weapon as he recognized the hopelessness of his position, surrounded now by the king's remaining guards. "You were always too soft to make the hard choices this kingdom required." "Perhaps," Alaric said quietly, "but soft choices do not include burning innocent families to force outcomes. I would have found another way to achieve. Whatever weakness you believe I carry, it does not compare to the cruelty you have shown." Corwin was taken into custody, his men either captured or fled into the surrounding forest, and the confrontation that had seemed destined to end in greater bloodshed concluded instead with the exposure of his treason laid bare before witnesses who could not deny what they had heard and seen. As the guards secured the prisoners for the journey back to the castle, Illyra found herself standing beside Alaric amid the wreckage of the clearing, both of them breathing hard from the tension of what had just occurred. He turned to her, his eyes searching her face with evident concern. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice softer now, the king's cold authority giving way once more to the man beneath. "I am well," Illyra said, though her hands still trembled slightly from the encounter. "Frightened, perhaps, but well." Alaric reached out gently, his hand brushing against hers in a silent gesture of relief and gratitude. "You did not have to fight," he said quietly. "You could have stayed hidden, safe from harm." "I could not simply stand by," Illyra said, meeting his gaze steadily despite her exhaustion. "Not when the truth of my family's destruction stood before me, close enough to finally be exposed." They stood together in the quiet aftermath of the clearing, the weight of the morning's revelations settling heavily around them, and though the danger of Corwin's treason had finally been confronted, Illyra understood that the path ahead, both for the kingdom and for whatever was growing between herself and the king, remained far from resolved. The journey back to the castle felt different from the desperate ride north hours earlier. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on every member of the party, there was a lightness in the air that had not existed before, a sense that a great danger had finally been named and contained, even if its consequences still needed to be fully addressed. Corwin rode bound and silent among the guards, his earlier defiance replaced now by a grim resignation. Illyra watched him occasionally from her place beside Alaric, searching his face for any hint of the man who had orchestrated so much suffering, but she found only a hollow bitterness that offered no satisfaction, only a quiet sadness at how much destruction one man's ambition had caused. They arrived at the castle as the sun climbed fully into the sky, and word of the morning's events spread swiftly through the halls even before Alaric could formally address his council. By the time he stood once more in the great hall, this time with Corwin brought forward in chains, the entire court had gathered, whispering anxiously among themselves. "Lord Corwin stands accused of treason against the crown," Alaric announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "of orchestrating the attack on Lady Alira's family home under false authority, and of conspiring with foreign powers against the stability of this kingdom." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles and advisors. Alira stood near the front of the hall, her heart pounding as she watched the reactions of those who had once looked at her only as a prisoner, a piece of political necessity. Now their eyes held something closer to sympathy, even respect, as the truth of what she had endured became known to all. Corwin was given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, but his words offered little beyond bitter justifications for choices that could not be forgiven. The council, once presented with the evidence Alira and Alaric had gathered together, along with the testimony of the guards who had witnessed his treasonous meeting at the border, found little room for leniency. "You will be stripped of your title and lands," Alaric declared, his voice heavy with the weight of judgment he clearly did not relish delivering, even against a man who had caused such harm. "You will be held within the kingdom's fortress until a full tribunal can determine the extent of your punishment for treason and the crimes committed against Lady Alira's family." Corwin said nothing further as he was led away, his silence perhaps the closest thing to acknowledgement of guilt that he was capable of offering. Alira watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and hollow sorrow. The man responsible for her family's destruction would finally face consequences for his actions. Yet nothing could return what she had lost. Her brother would not come back. Her childhood home would not be rebuilt from ashes into what it once was. Justice, however complete, could not undo grief. In the days that followed, the castle settled into a strange new rhythm. With Corwin's treason exposed, many of his allies within the court quietly distanced themselves, some fleeing before they could be questioned about their own involvement in his schemes. The kingdom's council, shaken by the depth of betrayal within their own ranks, worked swiftly to reinforce the border defenses against the still lingering threat from the northern territories that Corwin had sought to embolden. Alira found herself, for the first time since her arrival, without a clear role to occupy her days. She was no longer simply a prisoner, though her status within the kingdom remained undefined. She was not yet free to return to a home that no longer existed, nor fully settled into whatever place she might occupy within Varengard's walls going forward. The uncertainty left her restless, her mind constantly returning to the conversation she knew still needed to happen between herself and Alaric, the question of the bond that had first brought them together under such painful circumstances. She found him one evening in the garden, standing near the same fountain where they had first spoken honestly to each other weeks before. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression shifted, softening with a warmth that no longer surprised her the way it once had. "I have been thinking," she said, coming to stand beside him near the water, "about everything that has happened since I arrived here." "As have I," Alaric admitted, "though I confess, my thoughts have grown far more complicated than I expected them to be." Alira allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Complicated seems an accurate description of everything that has passed between us." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface of the fountain's water. Finally, Alira spoke the question that had been weighing on her mind since the confrontation with Corwin. "The bond," she said quietly. "Your council will press you again, now that the immediate crisis has passed. What will you tell them?" Alaric turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I will tell them the truth, that the decision remains yours, as it always has been. I will not force this upon you, Alira, regardless of what my council believes is necessary for the kingdom's stability." "And if I choose not to accept it?" Alira asked, watching his face carefully for any sign of the desperation Corwin had accused him of hiding beneath careful composure. What becomes of you, of the magic within your bloodline that grows more unstable each day? Then I will find another way to manage it, Alaric said, though the uncertainty in his voice suggested he did not fully believe such a solution existed. I would rather face that uncertain future than force you into a bond you did not choose freely, no matter the cost to myself. Illyra studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of manipulation in his words, any hint of the political calculation that had governed so much of her time within these walls. She found none, only honesty, and beneath it, a vulnerability that moved her more deeply than she had expected. I do not know what I want, she admitted softly. Weeks ago, I would have told you with absolute certainty that I could never choose to bind myself to you, that my hatred for what your kingdom had done would never allow such a thing. But now... She trailed off, unable to fully articulate the confusion of emotions that had grown within her since her arrival. Alaric waited patiently, giving her the space to find her own words rather than pressing her toward an answer she was not ready to give. Now I find that my anger has changed shape, she continued finally. It no longer points toward you the way it once did. I have watched you carry guilt for actions you did not commit, watched you refuse to force a decision upon me even when your own well-being depended upon it. I do not know if what I feel toward you is trust or something more, but I know it is no longer simple hatred. Alaric's expression softened with something that looked almost like hope, carefully restrained. I do not wish to rush you toward feelings you are not ready to name, he said gently. Take whatever time you need, Illyra. I will wait, for as long as it takes, for you to find your own answer. And if I never find one? She asked, though the question felt less like a challenge now and more like a genuine uncertainty she needed him to address. Then I will accept that outcome as well, Alaric said, though the words clearly cost him something to speak aloud. I would rather live with an unresolved bond than force you into a future you do not choose for yourself. His willingness to accept such an uncertain and difficult path, rather than pressure her toward the decision that would benefit him most, settled something within Illyra that she had not realized needed settling. She had spent weeks bracing herself against manipulation, against the possibility that his kindness was simply another tool used to secure what his kingdom required of her. But standing here now, in the quiet moonlit garden, she understood with growing certainty that his patience was genuine, unclouded by the political pressures surrounding them both. Thank you, she said softly, for giving me that choice, even when it would have been easier for you to take it from me. You deserve nothing less, Alaric said simply. They remained together in the garden a while longer, the conversation drifting into quieter, gentler territory. Memories of childhood, small joys they had each nearly forgotten amid the weight of recent events. For the first time since the fire had taken her home, Illyra found herself laughing genuinely, the sound surprising her with its unfamiliarity after so many weeks of grief and tension. As the night deepened and she finally returned to her chamber, Illyra lay awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling and turning over the events of the past weeks in her mind. She thought of her brother, of the home she had lost, of the anger that had once defined every waking moment since her capture. And she thought of Alaric, of his quiet honesty, his patience, the way he had stood beside her against Corwin's betrayal not as a king protecting his interests, but as someone who had come, against all her expectations, to genuinely care for her well-being above his own. She did not yet know what her final answer would be regarding the bond that could tie their fates together. But for the first time since arriving at Verengard, she found herself considering the possibility with something other than dread, and the realization both unsettled and comforted her in equal measure. The weeks that followed brought a fragile peace to Verengard, though beneath the surface, calm, new dangers were already beginning to stir. With Corwin imprisoned, and his network of allies scattered or exposed, the immediate threat to the kingdom's stability had eased, but the northern territories he had sought to embolden had not abandoned their ambitions simply because his scheme had failed. Reports began arriving with increasing frequency of troop movements along the border, small skirmishes testing the strength of Varengard's defenses. Alaric spent long hours in council meetings, his advisors urging swift and decisive action to secure the kingdom's borders before the threat could grow into something far more dangerous than isolated conflicts. Illyra found herself drawn increasingly into these discussions, her knowledge of the border territories, gained through years of living near them before her family's estate had fallen, proving unexpectedly valuable to the council's strategic planning. She was surprised, and quietly pleased, to find herself treated not as an outsider or a political pawn, but as someone whose insight was genuinely respected and sought after. "The northern commanders will not risk a full assault while winter approaches," she said during one such meeting, pointing to a worn map spread across the council table. "Their supply lines cannot support a prolonged campaign through the cold months. If they intend to strike, it will be swift and targeted, likely aimed at weakening morale rather than claiming significant territory." Alaric watched her with quiet admiration as she spoke, and though the council members around the table nodded thoughtfully at her assessment, it was his gaze she found herself most aware of, warm and steady even amid the tension of strategic planning. "Lady Illyra's assessment aligns with our own scouts' reports," General Bram, the head of Varengard's military forces, said approvingly. "I would recommend reinforcing the eastern watchtowers, where such a targeted strike would most likely occur." The council session continued late into the evening, plans forming and reforming as new information arrived, and by the time the meeting finally concluded, exhaustion had settled heavily over everyone present. Illyra lingered after the others had departed, gathering the maps and notes scattered across the table, when Alaric approached her quietly. "You have become an invaluable asset to this council," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth beneath its tiredness. "I do not think my advisors realized how much they underestimated you when you first arrived here." "I did not expect to find myself useful in matters of border strategy," Illyra admitted, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "Though I suppose growing up near a contested border does provide certain knowledge that proves difficult to forget." "It is more than knowledge," Alaric said, stepping closer. "You have a clarity of thought, a strength of judgment, that many who have served this council for years still struggle to match. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, for your willingness to share it." Illyra felt warmth rise in her cheeks at his words, though she tried to attribute it simply to the late hour and lingering exhaustion of the long meeting. "I want to help protect this kingdom," she said quietly, surprising herself with the sincerity of the admission. "Not simply because it has become my home in circumstances I never chose, but because I have come to care about what happens to the people within its borders, to you." The words hung between them, honest and unguarded in a way that neither of them had quite achieved before. Alaric's expression softened with something that looked almost like wonder, as though he had not truly allowed himself to hope for such a confession until this moment. "Illyra," he said softly, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I know I promised not to press you toward a decision you were not ready to make. But I must ask, has your heart found any clarity in these past weeks?" She looked up at him, at the vulnerability so plainly written across his features despite his careful composure as a king, and she felt the last remnants of her old resistance finally give way to something she could no longer deny. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that my heart found its answer before my mind was ready to admit it. I have watched you carry the weight of a kingdom with more compassion than I ever expected from the man I once believed had destroyed everything I loved. I have watched you choose patience over power, honesty over convenience, again and again, even when it cost you dearly. I do not hate you, Alaric. I have not hated you for a long while now." His hand tightened gently around hers, hope kindling openly in his eyes. "And the bond?" he asked softly. "Is that something you could choose, freely, for yourself?" Illyra took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the question settle over her, not as a burden imposed by circumstance or political necessity, but as a genuine choice she now found herself ready to make. I do not know everything the bond will mean, she admitted honestly. I do not know what changes it will bring, to either of us. But I find that I am no longer afraid of finding out. If it means standing beside you, truly beside you, as an equal, rather than a prisoner, or a political necessity, then yes, Alaric. I choose it. I choose you. The relief and joy that broke across his face in that moment was unlike anything Alira had seen from him before, the careful composure of the king giving way entirely to the raw emotion of the man beneath. He raised her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. You have given me more than I ever dared hope for, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise you, Alira, whatever the bond requires of us, I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret this choice. Their moment together was interrupted, as so many had been before, by the arrival of an urgent messenger, breathless from running through the castle corridors. Alaric's expression shifted quickly back into focused authority as he turned to receive the news, though he did not release Alira's hand. Your Majesty, the messenger said, scouts report movement along the eastern border, exactly as Lady Alira predicted. A small force approaches under cover of darkness, likely intending a targeted strike against the watchtowers. Rally the eastern garrison, Alaric commanded immediately, the weight of leadership settling once more across his shoulders. I will ride out within the hour to oversee the defense personally. I am coming with you, Alira said without hesitation, the same fierce determination that had carried her through the confrontation with Corwin rising once more within her. Alaric turned to her, concern and pride mingling in his expression. The battle will be dangerous, he said. I cannot ask you to risk yourself in this. You are not asking, Alira said firmly. I am choosing. I told you already, Alaric. I do not intend to stand idle while danger threatens what I have come to care for. Let me help defend this kingdom, as I have helped plan its defense. He studied her for a long moment, and though worry remained clearly visible in his eyes, he did not argue further. Then stay close to General Bram's forces, he said. I will not lose you now, not when we have finally found our way to this moment together. As preparations for the eastern defense moved swiftly through the castle, Alira found herself swept up in the urgency of the coming conflict, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. Whatever challenges awaited them at the border, she understood now that she would face them not as a reluctant prisoner bound by circumstance, but as someone who had chosen, freely and fully, to stand beside the King of Varengard as his equal and his chosen mate. The bond between them, though not yet formally sealed by whatever ancient magic bound his bloodline, had already begun to form in the quiet moments of trust and honesty they had built together, moment by moment, since the day she had first arrived as an enemy within these walls. And as she mounted her horse alongside the gathering forces preparing to ride toward the eastern border, Alira felt, for the first time since the fire had taken her home, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was riding now not simply to protect a kingdom that was not originally her own, but to protect a future she had chosen for herself, standing beside a man she had once sworn to hate, and now found herself unable to imagine living without. The ride to the eastern border was swift and tense, the gathering darkness pressing close around the column of soldiers as they moved through the countryside toward the watchtowers where the threat had been spotted. Alira rode near the front of the formation, close enough to Alaric that she could see the tight set of his jaw, the focused determination that had replaced the softer warmth of their earlier conversation. They arrived at the eastern garrison as the last light of dusk faded from the sky, the watchtowers rising dark and silent against the deepening blue above. General Bram met them at the gates, his expression grim with the weight of command. The scouts report the enemy force is smaller than initially feared, he said, perhaps 30 men, moving quietly toward the northernmost tower. Likely intended as a demonstration of strength rather than a true invasion attempt. Small numbers can still cause significant damage if they catch the tower unprepared, Alaric said, already moving toward the war table set up within the garrison's central hall. What is our current readiness? "The tower garrison has been reinforced as ordered," Bram replied, "though I would recommend positioning additional archers along the ridge overlooking the approach, in case the enemy attempts to use the darkness to their advantage." Illyra listened carefully as the commanders finalized their strategy, occasionally offering input drawn from her knowledge of the surrounding terrain, knowledge that proved valuable once again as the defenders worked to anticipate every possible angle of attack. She felt a strange calm settle over her despite the danger ahead, born not from a lack of fear, but from a growing confidence in her own ability to contribute meaningfully to whatever came next. As the final preparations were made, Alaric found a moment to pull her aside, away from the bustle of soldiers moving into position. "I want you to remain here, within the garrison walls, once the fighting begins," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I know you wish to help, and you have already done so a great deal through your council, but I cannot allow you into direct danger if it can be avoided." Illyra wanted to argue, the same fierce determination that had carried her through the confrontation with Corwin rising within her once more. But she recognized, too, the genuine fear underlying his request, and she understood that his concern came not from a desire to control her, but from the depth of feeling that had grown between them. "I will remain within the walls," she agreed finally, "though I reserve the right to act if the situation grows dire enough to require it." Alaric's expression softened with relief, and he reached for her hand briefly before duty called him away to oversee the final defensive positions. "Thank you," he said. "Whatever happens tonight, know that my heart remains with you, wherever this battle takes me." The waiting that followed proved almost harder than action itself, the tension within the garrison walls thick as the defenders held their positions in the darkness, watching and listening for any sign of the approaching threat. Illyra stood near one of the upper windows of the central hall, watching the dark tree line beyond the watchtowers, her heart pounding with each passing minute of uncertain silence. It was nearly midnight when the first signal fires flared along the ridge, alerting the garrison that the enemy force had been spotted moving toward the northern tower exactly as anticipated. The sounds of battle soon followed, distant at first, then growing closer as the conflict unfolded in the darkness beyond the walls. Illyra watched from her window with growing anxiety, unable to see clearly what was happening beyond the flickering light of torches and the distant clash of steel. Time seemed to stretch impossibly as she waited for word of how the battle progressed, her mind filled with worry for Alaric's safety despite her confidence in the careful strategy the commanders had prepared. A runner arrived breathless at the garrison gates sometime later, bearing news that sent a fresh wave of fear through Illyra's chest. "The northern tower holds," the runner reported to the officers remaining within the hall, "but the king has moved forward with a small contingent to cut off the enemy's retreat. They have encountered heavier resistance than expected." Illyra's heart clenched painfully at the news. Without waiting for permission, without pausing to consider the promise she had made to remain within the walls, she moved swiftly toward the stables, driven by an urgency she could not ignore. "My lady," one of the remaining guards called after her, "the king commanded that you remain here." "The king is in danger," Illyra said firmly, already mounting one of the garrison's horses. "I cannot simply wait here while that remains true. Send word to General Bram that I ride to offer what aid I can." She rode out into the darkness before the guard could stop her, her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure as she followed the distant sounds of continued conflict toward the northern approach. The night air was cold against her face, the sounds of battle growing louder as she drew closer to where Alaric's forces had engaged the enemy. She found the scene chaotic upon her arrival, torches scattered across a small clearing where the remnants of the enemy force fought desperately against Alaric's contingent, clearly outmatched but fighting with the reckless energy of soldiers who understood retreat was no longer an option. Illyra's eyes searched frantically through the confusion until she spotted Alaric near the center of the fighting, his sword moving with practiced precision as he held his ground against two attackers simultaneously. Fear seized her chest as she watched one of the enemy soldiers circle behind him, unseen in the chaos, weapon raised for a strike that Alaric had no way of anticipating in the heat of his current engagement. Without thinking, without calculating the danger to herself, Illyra urged her horse forward, calling out a warning that cut sharply through the noise of battle. "Alaric, behind you!" He turned just in time, his instincts sharp despite the exhaustion of prolonged combat, deflecting the surprise attack with a swift motion that saved him from what would have been a devastating blow. The soldier who had attempted the strike stumbled back, quickly subdued by one of Alaric's guards who had noticed the danger only a moment after Illyra's warning. The battle turned decisively in the defenders' favor shortly after, the remaining enemy soldiers either captured or forced into a hasty retreat back toward the border they had crossed. As the clearing finally fell quiet, the adrenaline of combat slowly giving way to the exhaustion of its aftermath, Alaric turned to find Illyra still mounted at the edge of the clearing, her face pale with the lingering fear of what she had witnessed. He moved toward her immediately, relief and concern warring across his features. "You were meant to remain within the garrison walls," he said, though the sharpness in his voice could not fully hide the gratitude beneath it. "You would be dead if I had," Illyra said simply, dismounting to stand before him, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension of the ride and the danger she had witnessed. Alaric's expression softened, and he reached for her, pulling her gently into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of the depth of relief he felt at her safety, and hers at his. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair, "for disobeying me, this once." "Do not grow accustomed to it," Illyra said, though a small, exhausted smile touched her lips, despite the seriousness of the moment. They remained together for a long moment amid the quiet aftermath of the battle, the weight of danger finally beginning to lift as the reality of their survival settled over them both. Around them, the garrison's soldiers moved to secure the captured enemy combatants and tend to the wounded, the immediate threat to the eastern border finally repelled. As dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Illyra and Alaric stood together amid the aftermath of conflict, both changed by the events of the night, both more certain than ever of the bond that had grown between them, forged now not only through shared grief and slow-building trust, but through the fire of battle faced together, side by side, as true equals in every sense that mattered. The journey back to the castle following the battle at the eastern border felt entirely different from the tense ride that had carried them there. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on every member of the returning column, a quiet triumph settled over the group. The immediate threat to the kingdom's stability finally addressed through both careful strategy and hard-won courage. News of the successful defense spread quickly through Varengard, and by the time Alaric and Illyra rode through the castle gates, a crowd of relieved citizens and courtiers had gathered to welcome them home. Illyra found herself unexpectedly moved by the warmth of their reception, the calls of gratitude and celebration that greeted not only the king's safe return, but hers as well. "They have come to see you differently," Wenna observed later that day, finding Illyra resting in the garden after the long journey. "No longer simply as the prisoner brought here by circumstance, but as someone who has fought and sacrificed for this kingdom's protection. I did not fight for the kingdom alone," Illyra admitted quietly. "I fought for him, for Alaric. The kingdom's well-being has simply become tied to that in ways I did not expect when I first arrived here." Wenna smiled knowingly, settling onto the bench beside her. "Love has a way of expanding our loyalties beyond what we first imagined possible," she said. "I suspected, from the earliest days of your arrival, that something significant would grow between you and the king. I did not expect it would take the shape of genuine partnership, forged through such difficult trials, but perhaps that makes it stronger than it might otherwise have been." Illyra considered the old woman's words carefully, thinking of everything that had passed since the day she had first arrived at Varengard's gates, angry and grieving, certain that nothing could ever soften her hatred for the kingdom that had destroyed her home. She thought of Alaric's patience, his honesty, his willingness to expose the truth even when it complicated his own position, his refusal to force the bond upon her despite the desperate need his counsel had impressed upon him. "I am ready," she said finally, more to herself than to Wenna, though the old woman's expression suggested she understood exactly what Alira meant. "Then you should tell him," Wenna said gently. "He has waited with more patience than most kings would have shown, but I do not think that patience comes without cost to his own heart." Alira found Alaric later that evening in his private study, poring over reports from the border with the tired diligence of a ruler who understood that peace, however welcome, required constant vigilance to maintain. He looked up as she entered, his expression brightening despite his obvious exhaustion. "I did not expect to see you again so soon," he said, setting aside the reports as she approached. "I assumed you would need rest after the events of the past days." "I could not rest," Alira said, "not until I had spoken with you about something important." Alaric's expression grew attentive, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features, as though he feared what she might say despite the warmth that had grown between them. "Whatever it is," he said, "I am listening." "I am ready," Alira said simply, echoing the words she had spoken to herself in the garden, "to accept the bond between us. Not because your counsel demands it, not because the kingdom's stability requires it, but because I have come to love you, Alaric, freely and completely, and I wish to stand beside you not as a political necessity, but as your equal partner in every sense." The words hung in the quiet study, and for a long moment, Alaric simply stared at her, as though needing time to fully absorb the depth of what she had offered him. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his face, warmer and more unguarded than any she had seen from him before. "You have given me something I feared I might never deserve," he said, rising from his chair to close the distance between them. "I have loved you, Alira, since long before I understood what that love truly meant. Since the earliest days when your fierce spirit challenged everything I believed a captive should be. I did not dare hope you might come to feel the same, not after everything my kingdom, however unknowingly, took from you. You did not take my brother from me, nor my home," Alira said softly, reaching up to gently touch his face. "Corwin's ambition did that, hiding behind your authority without your knowledge or consent. I have made my peace with that truth, and with the man who has shown me, again and again, that his heart holds far more compassion than the stories ever suggested." Their lips met in a gentle, unhurried kiss, sealing the unspoken promise that had been growing between them since the earliest days of careful honesty in the garden beneath her window. When they finally parted, Alaric rested his forehead gently against hers, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that spoke more clearly than words of the depth of feeling he had carried for her. "The bond ceremony," he said softly, "requires the presence of the full council, along with certain ancient rites tied to my bloodline's magic. It is not something that can be arranged hastily, though I confess I am eager for it to be completed." "Then let us prepare properly," Alira said, a small smile touching her lips. "I find that I no longer wish to rush toward this moment out of fear or desperation, but to approach it with the same care and honesty that has brought us here." Plans for the ceremony began the following day, the castle abuzz with preparation despite the recent turmoil of Corwin's betrayal and the border conflict that had followed so closely after. Alira found herself, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely embraced by the court that had once viewed her with suspicion or pity. Nobles who had previously kept their distance now sought her counsel and company, recognizing in her not simply the king's chosen mate, but a woman of genuine strength and wisdom who had earned her place within Varengard's walls through trial rather than mere circumstance. Wenna took particular joy in overseeing the preparations, her weathered face brightening with a warmth Alira had rarely seen from the careful, guarded woman who had first greeted her as a prisoner so many weeks before. "I have served this castle through many difficult seasons," Wenna said one afternoon, helping Alira select fabrics for the ceremonial garments the ancient rites required. "I do not believe I have ever prepared for a bonding with such genuine hope for the happiness it will bring." As the day of the ceremony approached, Elira found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the ashes of her family's estate to the halls of the very kingdom responsible, however indirectly, for that destruction. She thought of her brother often during these quiet moments of reflection, wondering what he might have thought of the path her life had taken, whether he would have understood the love that had grown from such painful beginnings, or whether grief would have made such understanding impossible for him to offer. She found comfort, ultimately, in believing that he would have wanted her happiness above all else, that he would have recognized in Alaric the same qualities she herself had come to cherish: honesty in the face of difficult truths, courage in confronting betrayal within his own ranks, and a depth of compassion that no crown or title could diminish. On the eve of the ceremony, Elira stood once more at the window of her chamber, looking out over the garden where so much of her transformation had taken place, from grieving prisoner to willing partner in the future of a kingdom she had once sworn to despise. The moon hung full and bright over the castle, casting silver light across the familiar paths where she and Alaric had shared their earliest moments of honest connection. Tomorrow, the ancient magic of Varengard's bloodline would bind her fate formally to Alaric's, sealing not only the political stability the kingdom required, but the genuine love that had grown between them through fire, betrayal, and the slow, careful building of trust. She felt no fear as she considered what lay ahead, only a quiet, steady certainty that she had found, against every expectation shaped by grief and loss, a future worth choosing for herself. The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and bright, the kind of crisp autumn day that seemed to promise new beginnings. Elira woke early, her heart steady despite the significance of what the day would bring, and found Wenna already waiting in her chamber with the ceremonial garments carefully prepared. "You slept well?" Wenna asked, helping her into the flowing gown of deep blue and silver, colors that represented both her own heritage and the House of Varengard woven together in careful symbolism. "Better than I expected," Elira admitted, studying her reflection in the polished mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different from the frightened, furious girl who had arrived at these gates weeks before, though the same fierce spirit remained visible in her eyes, tempered now by hard-won wisdom rather than diminished by grief. "The kingdom has never seen a bonding quite like this one," Wenna said, carefully arranging Elira's hair with practiced hands. "Most bonds throughout Varengard's history were arranged through careful political calculation, families brought together for mutual advantage rather than genuine affection. What you and the king share, forged through such difficult trials, is rare indeed." Elira thought of the long road that had led her to this moment, the fire that had taken her home, the anger that had once consumed her every thought, the slow and careful unfolding of trust that had transformed her understanding of the man she had once believed responsible for all her suffering. "I would not have chosen this path," she said quietly, "given the choice from the very beginning. But I find that I would not trade where it has brought me, not now." The ceremony itself took place in the Great Hall, transformed for the occasion with garlands of autumn flowers and banners bearing both the sigil of Varengard and a new symbol, carefully designed to represent the joining of two houses, one nearly destroyed by war, now finding renewal through this unexpected union. The full council had gathered, along with representatives from neighboring territories who had come to witness the historic bonding, hoping perhaps that the union might herald a new era of stability for the region. Elira walked the length of the hall with steady steps, her eyes finding Alaric waiting at its far end, dressed in formal robes that could not fully disguise the warmth and anticipation visible in his expression as he watched her approach. The ancient priestess who would perform the bonding rites stood beside him, an elderly woman whose weathered face carried the wisdom of decades spent studying the old magic tied to Varengard's royal bloodline. "Do you come freely?" the priestess asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, without coercion or hidden design, to join your fate with that of King Alaric of Varengard? "I do," Elira answered, her voice steady and sure despite the weight of the assembled witnesses watching her every word. And do you, King Alaric, come freely to join your fate with that of Lady Elira, understanding fully the responsibilities and sacrifices such a bond requires? I do, Alaric said, his eyes never leaving Elira's face as he spoke the words. The priestess guided them through the ancient rites that followed, words spoken in a language Elira did not fully understand, but felt resonate through her very bones as the ceremony progressed. A soft golden light began to gather around their joined hands as the final words of binding were spoken. The old magic of Varengard's bloodline, recognizing and accepting the bond being formed between them. Elira felt a warmth spread through her chest as the magic settled, not overwhelming or frightening as she had half feared it might be, but gentle, like the quiet certainty of finding exactly where she belonged after a long and difficult journey. She glanced up to find Alaric watching her with an expression of profound relief and joy. The tension that had lived within him for so long, the strain of the unstable magic that had troubled his mind and judgment, visibly easing as the bond settled fully into place. "It is done," the priestess declared, and a wave of celebration swept through the great hall, the assembled witnesses breaking into applause and joyful cries that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Alaric drew Elira close, his forehead resting gently against hers as the celebration continued around them. "How do you feel?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a tenderness reserved only for this private moment between them. "Whole," Elira answered honestly, surprised by the truth of the word even as she spoke it, as though something that had been broken within me has finally found its proper place again. "That is precisely how I feel as well," Alaric admitted. "The magic that once threatened to consume me now feels steady, grounded, as though your presence has given it exactly the anchor it always needed." In the weeks that followed the ceremony, Varengard settled into a period of genuine peace and renewal unlike anything the kingdom had experienced in many years. With Corwin's treason fully exposed and dealt with through proper tribunal, and the northern border secured through both careful diplomacy and demonstrated strength, the immediate threats to the kingdom's stability had been thoroughly addressed. Alaric ruled now with a clarity and steadiness his advisors had not seen in years, the bond with Elira providing exactly the stability the ancient magic of his bloodline required. Elira, for her part, found herself embraced fully by the kingdom she had once entered as a grieving captive. She continued to offer her counsel on matters of border strategy and diplomacy, her insight proving valuable time and again as Varengard worked to rebuild trust with neighboring territories shaken by Corwin's manipulations. She also began, with Alaric's full support, to oversee the rebuilding of her family's ancestral lands, transforming the ashes of destruction into a memorial that honored her brother's memory while creating new opportunities for the families who had once depended upon her house for their livelihoods. "I want it to become something beautiful again," she told Alaric one evening as they reviewed plans for the reconstruction together. "Not simply rebuilt as it once was, but transformed into something that honors what was lost while creating space for new growth." "Whatever you envision," Alaric said, studying the careful sketches she had prepared, "I will ensure the full resources of this kingdom support its realization. Your home deserves nothing less than the same care and dedication you have shown this kingdom since your arrival." As the months passed, Elira found herself, more often than not, genuinely happy in ways she had believed impossible during those first dark days following her family's destruction. The grief for her brother and the home she had lost never fully disappeared, remaining instead a quiet, permanent part of who she had become, but it no longer defined her every waking thought. In its place had grown something she had never expected to find again, a sense of purpose, a genuine partnership built on hard-won trust, and a love that had emerged, against every reasonable expectation, from the very destruction that had once seemed to promise only endless hatred. Standing together one evening, in the same garden where their careful honesty had first begun to bridge the divide between captor and captive, Elira leaned against Alaric's shoulder, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold over the kingdom they now ruled together as true partners. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have ended?" she asked quietly. "If I had never learned the truth about Corwin, if you had chosen to force the bond rather than wait for my genuine choice." "Often," Alaric admitted, wrapping his arm gently around her. "I do not believe such a path would have led us here, to this genuine happiness we have found together. Forced bonds, however politically convenient, rarely produce the kind of partnership we have built through patience and honesty." "I am grateful," Alira said softly, "that you understood that difference, even when your counsel pressed you toward a swifter, less careful solution." "I am grateful," Alaric replied, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, "that you found it within yourself to look beyond the grief and anger that circumstance gave you every right to hold on to, and to see, eventually, the truth of who I truly was beneath the title that first divided us." They remained together in comfortable silence as the sun finally set fully below the horizon, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above Varengard's towers. The kingdom that had once been the source of Alira's deepest grief had become, through patience, honesty, and the slow, careful building of genuine trust, the place she now called home, standing beside the man she had once sworn to hate, now bound to him not through ancient magic alone, but through a love that had proven strong enough to transform even the deepest wounds of the past into the foundation for a shared and hopeful future.